November 17th, 1965. The trap springs. Shut the jungle near landing zone Albany reeked of cordite, mud, and blood, thick in the humid air like an invisible fog. It was just past midday as Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry trudged forward, boots sucking at the soggy ground with every exhausted step. After 3 days of brutal combat near LZ X-Ray, in the opening moves of the first major battle between U.S. forces and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, the men were physically shattered, emotionally drained, and utterly unaware of the mortal danger awaiting them. Their fatigues clung wetly to their bodies, caked with red Central Highlands dust and dark sweat stains. The jungle seemed alive, not with birdsong, but with an eerie silence, the kind that had preceded ambushes many times before. But these soldiers, hungry and hollow-eyed from near-constant marching and scattered firefights, were too numb to notice. Radio operators hunched over their bulky sets, trying to maintain contact with higher command. Platoon leaders barked hoarse orders, trying to keep their units moving forward through the chaotic undergrowth. Medics double-checked their dwindling supplies, unaware that they, too, were marked men. They didn't know that they were marching straight into the jaws of death. At 1:20 p.m., the jungle exploded. Without warning, from the thick tree lines on 3 sides, over 300 NVA regulars unleashed a hurricane of automatic fire, grenades, and mortars. These weren't conscripts or green guerrillas. They were battle-hardened veterans, men who had bled the French white at Dien Bien Phu a decade earlier. They had set their trap with grim precision, allowing the Americans to walk deep into a clearing, and then striking with overwhelming violence. The first volleys were devastating. Entire squads fell where they stood, shredded by machine guns and SKS rifle fire. Radio operators, the lifelines to artillery and air support, were among the first targets. Many were cut down mid-sentence, clutching their handsets in death grips, calling for help that couldn't distinguish friend from enemy in the chaos. The elephant grass, 6 feet tall in places, became a deadly trap. Marines and soldiers couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but the NVA could, moving silently through the dense blades to slit throats at point-blank range or pump bullets into bewildered men. Medics, marked by the red crosses on their armbands and helmets, crawled out to help the fallen, only to be targeted mercilessly by enemy snipers. There was no protection for the wounded. Soldiers lying helplessly in the grass often endured a second, finishing bullet as NVA soldiers stalked the field, ensuring that none survived. Within minutes, Alpha Company had been nearly annihilated. Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, the legendary and gravel-voiced veteran who had fought at Normandy, Sicily, and earlier that week at LZ X-Ray, would later sum it up with brutal clarity. Albany wasn't a battle. It was a goddamn slaughterhouse. Men fought and died in clusters, isolated from each other by the thick brush and high grass. Chain of command disintegrated almost immediately. Survivors grouped together instinctively, forming small, desperate pockets of resistance. They fired in all directions, often hitting nothing but trees or each other, so thick was the confusion. Artillery batteries tried to respond, but with American units so intermingled with the NVA, every call for fire risked killing their own. Helicopter gunships, called in for support, were often waved off, or fired blind, desperate to stem the slaughter. The battlefield became a surreal hellscape, bodies tangled together in the high grass, rifles fallen from lifeless hands, blood pooling into the muddy ground. Some soldiers displayed incredible acts of heroism amid the madness. Sergeant Ernie Savage, assuming command of a cut-off platoon, called in precise artillery strikes almost on top of his own position to beat back the NVA. Specialist Bill Beck, riddled with wounds, continued to pass ammunition to his comrades until he bled out. Private First Class William Bill Stockdale dragged 3 wounded men to safety under relentless fire, only to be killed moments later. Yet heroism could not stem the tide of death. The NVA, following well-rehearsed tactics, launched wave after wave of attacks, each probing the American lines for weakness. Some enemy soldiers, running low on ammunition, used bayonets or captured American rifles, slaughtering the wounded where they lay. Others set up L-shaped ambushes to channel fleeing Americans into kill zones. For hours, the jungle was a cauldron of gunfire, screams, and explosions. Smoke from burning grass and mangled helicopters drifted through the canopy, staining the sun a sickly red. Soldiers who survived would later describe Albany as feeling like the gates of hell had opened, and hell had swallowed them whole. Finally, as night fell and reinforcements began to arrive, the NVA began to pull back, melting away into the jungle like ghosts. They had inflicted staggering losses. When medevac choppers finally landed the next morning, they found a battlefield littered with over 150 American dead, many still clutching their weapons in frozen death grips. Survivors stumbled toward the landing zones, eyes hollow, faces gray with exhaustion and shock. Some wept openly. Others said nothing, simply collapsing into the waiting arms of medics. The Battle of LZ Albany would go down as the single bloodiest day for American forces during the entire Vietnam War. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming horror, those who endured found meaning in their survival and in the sacrifice of their brothers. As one exhausted lieutenant later said, voice cracking as he stared at the smoking wreckage of Albany, "We weren't fighting for Johnson or Westmoreland or politics. We fought for the guy next to us. We fought because that's what you do when everything is falling apart. You hold the line." Hell in the high grass. The sun set and rose again over LZ Albany, but for the men of the 7th Cavalry, time had lost all meaning. For 16 uninterrupted hours, they fought not a conventional battle, but a nightmare, a savage, personal, and chaotic struggle for survival that defied every notion of modern warfare. In the high elephant grass of Vietnam's Central Highlands, war reverted to its most primal form. Close-quarters butchery. As ammunition dwindled and rifles jammed with mud and blood, soldiers were forced to fight with whatever they could grasp. M16s, so effective at range, became bludgeons as men swung them like clubs. Entrenching tools, the small shovels every infantryman carried, were sharpened and used to hack at enemies in the smoke and confusion. Fists, boots, knives, and helmets became weapons of desperate last resort. In many places, fighting occurred hand to hand, face to face, breath hot against the enemy's neck. Soldiers grappled in the tangled grass, rolling in the blood-soaked mud, their screams drowned by the roar of battle. Stories later emerged of bayonets being driven into chests, only for the dying enemy to pull his attacker down with him. There was no mercy, no time for hesitation. It was raw, unfiltered survival. The lost platoon. One of the most haunting chapters of Albany was the fate of Bravo Company's 3rd Platoon. Cut off in the initial ambush, these 29 young men found themselves completely surrounded, their radios either destroyed or jammed by enemy interference. They dug shallow depressions in the earth, piling up the bodies of their fallen comrades for cover. For hours, they repelled assault after assault, shooting until their barrels overheated and grenades were reduced to improvised bombs made from ration cans and explosives. Still, the NVA came. By the time relief forces reached them, only 5 men were left alive. Some had played dead for hours, lying among the corpses of friends, too wounded or too terrified to move. Others had fought on, wounded and delirious, until they physically could not lift their weapons anymore. One survivor, badly burned and nearly unconscious, later whispered, "We never surrendered. We just ran out of life." Friendly fire horror. Desperate calls for air support led to another cruel tragedy. In the chaos and confusion of overlapping positions and broken communications, A-1 Sky Raiders, slow but heavily armed ground attack aircraft, swooped low over the battlefield to drop napalm and deliver rocket strikes. But without clear markings and with American and NVA soldiers fighting literally side by side, targeting was a deadly guessing game. Several bombs fell directly onto American positions. In an instant, the tall grass ignited into roaring walls of flame. Men already wounded and unable to move were burned alive where they lay. Others, seeing the fire racing toward them, threw off their gear and ran, only to be shot down by NVA snipers lying in wait. Survivors would bear the physical and psychological scars of that terrible moment for the rest of their lives. PFC James Shadden's memory. Private First Class. James Shadden, a farm boy from Oklahoma who had barely been shaving when he boarded the plane to Vietnam, remembered the horror vividly. Huddled with a handful of survivors in a makeshift defensive ring, he watched in mute terror as the enemy closed in under the cover of darkness. "The NVA were inside our perimeter," he later recalled. "I saw a lieutenant about 10 feet away. He pulled his .45 and shot 3 NVA soldiers as they charged him one after another, but a fourth one came from the side. He had a bayonet already fixed. I saw it punch right through the lieutenant's chest. He tried to say something, 'Tell my wife.' But before he could finish, the NVA soldier twisted the blade, and he was gone." The brutality of that single moment, the suddenness of death, the unfinished farewell, encapsulated the sheer human tragedy of LZ Albany. The will to endure. Despite the horrors, the men of the 7th Cavalry held their ground. Sergeants led squads after their officers fell, often rallying men with nothing more than sheer force of will. Wounded soldiers fought from prone positions, squeezing off single shots at shadowy figures in the smoke and darkness. There were moments when the line between sanity and madness blurred. Some men fired at phantom enemies, their rifles empty but their minds unwilling to accept it. Others fell into shock, staring blankly at the carnage around them. Yet somehow, amid the slaughter, small miracles occurred. Medics, risking certain death, crawled from body to body, dragging the wounded into makeshift triage points. Chaplains whispered last rites over men too far gone to save, and every man who could still fight did so, not for orders, not for glory, but for the brother beside him. When the guns fell silent, when the final shots faded into the dripping silence of the jungle and the NVA slipped away under cover of darkness, LZ Albany lay shattered. 155 Americans were dead, most within the first few hours of the ambush. Hundreds more were wounded, many maimed for life. Among the dead were men still clutching family photos, dog tags blackened by fire, letters home that would never be sent. Yet, out of that hellish crucible, the survivors emerged bearing something more enduring than wounds, a bond of brotherhood forged in the fiercest fires of combat. As one grizzled veteran, interviewed decades later, said while standing over the rebuilt LZ Albany, "If you didn't fight there, you'll never understand it. We went through hell together. Some of us stayed behind. In that grass forever. The rest of us just kept marching, carrying their memory." The aftermath. A field of broken men. As the pale light of dawn crept over the blood-soaked clearing of Landing Zone Albany, a terrible silence settled across the battlefield. The jungle, so recently alive with gunfire, screams, and the roar of artillery, now lay still, save for the low, ragged moans of the wounded. When reinforcements from the 1st Cavalry Division finally hacked their way through the dense vegetation and stumbled onto the site, they stopped in stunned horror. Even the most hardened veterans among them, men who had fought in Korea or seen the worst Vietnam had to offer, were overwhelmed. Before them stretched a scene of almost indescribable carnage, a field of broken bodies and shattered lives. 155 Americans lay dead, sprawled across a patch of ground smaller than 2 football fields. Many were frozen in the positions in which they fell, some clutching rifles, others curled into themselves as if trying to ward off the inevitable. Helmets lay scattered like discarded toys, gear shredded and burned. Blood pooled in craters where grenades had ripped apart the earth, and the men lying in it. 124 more were wounded, many with ghastly injuries that defied belief. Deep bayonet thrusts to the chest and stomach, wounds so savage that intestines spilled into the mud. Faces and limbs blackened and charred by napalm, the flesh fused to twisted remnants of gear. Gunshot wounds so numerous in some bodies that medics could hardly find a place to apply pressure. The ferocity of the ambush became grimly clear in the stark numbers. It was the single bloodiest day for the 7th Cavalry since Custer fell at the Little Bighorn, an eerie and bitter parallel that would not be lost on the survivors. The enemy's disappearing act. Despite the devastating American losses, when commanders tried to assess enemy casualties, they found only 84 NVA bodies on the field. The North Vietnamese, adhering to their strict battlefield discipline, had dragged most of their dead and wounded back into the jungle under cover of darkness. It was a chilling tactic. It denied the Americans intelligence. It denied them a sense of victory, and it left the survivors wondering if the enemy had ever truly been defeated, or if they were simply biding their time for the next ambush. As Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, who had taken command mid-battle, bitterly noted, "We counted the cost, but we couldn't even count all the faces that had tried to kill us." The grim work of evacuation. The aftermath brought no relief, only another form of hell. Helicopter pilots, many of them veterans of the earlier battle at LZ Ray, were called in to evacuate the wounded and recover the dead. Men like Major Bruce Crandall, already a legend for his daring resupply flights, now faced a far more gruesome task. The jungle clearing could not contain the sheer volume of casualties. Makeshift landing zones were carved out with explosives and sheer brute force. Medics and stretcher teams raced through the grass, stepping over corpses, trying to find the living among the dead. Crandall would later describe the horror with grim clarity. "We were stacking bodies like cordwood. You couldn't tell some of them apart. Boys so torn up you couldn't lift them properly. We had to use ponchos, scooping up pieces, trying to give them enough dignity to make it home." The evacuation helicopters became airborne coffins, blood pooling in the floors, the air thick with the metallic stink of death and burning flesh. The flight back to base was often silent, the pilots choking back tears or rage, the survivors too numb to speak. The hidden scars. Even for those who left the battlefield with bodies intact, the wounds ran deep. Survivors' guilt gnawed at many, knowing they had lived while better men had fallen. Nightmares haunted them, visions of bayonets flashing in the high grass, the cries of the wounded calling for mothers or wives. Silence became the armor of many veterans, a way to shield themselves and their loved ones from memories too painful to share. Some survivors could never again stand the sound of helicopters. Others avoided tall grass for the rest of their lives. Many more simply carried the battlefield with them, invisible but ever present. The unseen toll. In the months and years that followed, commanders would write reports, historians would study maps and tactics, and generals would parse the lessons learned. But no map or official communique could capture the true cost of LZ Albany. It was measured not just in numbers, but in memories. A lieutenant whose last words were cut short by a bayonet. A young private who died clutching his fiancée's photo to his chest. A medic who cried over the bodies of boys he couldn't save. A chaplain who ran out of prayers before he ran out of dying men. The final echo, as the last helicopters lifted away, carrying the wounded. And the dead from LZ Albany, a strange emptiness settled over the clearing. The jungle, indifferent and eternal, began to reclaim the ground. Grass would grow again. Trees would arch overhead once more. The rains would wash away the blood. But for those who had fought and bled there, LZ Albany would never be just another patch of jungle. It would be a place where courage and horror intertwined, a place where ordinary boys had been asked to endure the unimaginable. Why LZ Albany was erased from history. In the grand narrative of the Vietnam War, Landing Zone Albany should have been etched into the American consciousness with the same gravity as LZ X-ray. Instead, it became a forgotten battlefield, its memory preserved only in the minds of those who bled there and the families who never saw their sons come home. The reasons for Albany's erasure were as complex as they were tragic. No photographs. The battle nobody saw. Unlike the brutal but better-known fight at LZ X-ray, where famed reporter Joe Galloway and other journalists captured words and images that electrified the American public, no reporters witnessed Albany. There were no iconic photographs of desperate medics tending the wounded. No front-page headlines showing the shattered faces of survivors. No grainy newsreels to broadcast the horror into living rooms across America. Without pictures, Albany lacked the visual proof that so often drives collective memory. In a war increasingly fought on television screens, what could not be seen was too easily forgotten. Military embarrassment. A textbook ambush. The U.S. Army prided itself on technological superiority and battlefield dominance, but at Albany, 300 North Vietnamese regulars executed a textbook ambush on a moving American column and succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The carefully laid trap devastated Alpha and Bravo companies of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. Men were killed before they could fire a shot. Entire platoons were wiped out within minutes. For the Pentagon, Albany was an uncomfortable truth. It exposed critical failures in reconnaissance, communication, and command. Worse, it shattered the illusion that superior firepower alone could guarantee victory in Vietnam. Rather than trumpet the disaster, military officials quietly minimized Albany's significance, burying it under reports of successful engagements and enemy losses inflicted, a bitter distortion of reality. Survivor trauma. The silence of the damned. Perhaps the most heartbreaking reason Albany faded into obscurity was the survivors themselves. The men who lived through that 16-hour nightmare carried wounds that ran deeper than flesh. Many could not, or would not, speak of what happened in that clearing. They had seen comrades bayoneted before their eyes. They had heard the cries of the wounded burning alive under friendly napalm. They had watched friends die screaming for mothers and wives who would never know their final moments. To speak of Albany was to relive it. And for many, the only way to survive was to bury the memories alongside the dead. Colonel Thomas Brown, who helped oversee the grim task of recovering the bodies, later confessed with raw honesty, "After Albany, I knew Vietnam would be a long war, and that we might not win it." It was a chilling realization, and one few wanted to acknowledge in 1965. The ghosts of Albany today. Though decades have passed, the legacy of LZ Albany still casts a long and painful shadow, the wall's silent testimony. In the heart of Washington, D.C., at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, visitors often pause before Panel 3 East, a black granite slab etched with 31 names. Most who read those names have no idea that they represent the men who died at Albany, young soldiers caught in the worst single day of bloodshed the 7th Cavalry would endure in Vietnam. There are no bronze plaques or grand monuments to mark their sacrifice, just names carved in silence for those who know where to look. Reunions of the damned. Every year, a small, aging group of survivors gathers to remember. There are no grand parades, no speeches filled with patriotic platitudes, just quiet conversations, shared over beer and fading photographs. They call themselves the last true brothers, bound not just by shared service, but by a trauma few outsiders can comprehend. At these reunions, old wounds resurface. Men break down weeping at the memory of a lost friend's last smile. Some still hear the whispered pleas for help that they could not answer. Others sit in silence, staring at nothing, lost in battles that ended decades ago but never really stopped. For them, Albany is not a historical footnote. It is a living memory, a scar that never fully healed. Lessons unlearned. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the hard, bitter lessons of Albany were often ignored in the years that followed. Despite the evidence of how vulnerable American forces were to ambushes in dense terrain, the war's strategy did not fundamentally change. The enemy continued to exploit American movement along predictable trails. More patrols were ambushed. More lives were lost to the same flanking tactics that had turned Albany into a slaughterhouse. In a grim echo, places like Dak To, Firebase Ripcord, and Hamburger Hill would see American units trapped and devastated under similar conditions. The ghosts of Albany marched on, unseen but ever present. The final word. As medic Bill Beck, who survived both the furnace of LZ X-ray and the hell of LZ Albany, so poignantly put it, we left our innocence in that elephant grass, along with the best men I'll ever know. The words hang in the air, heavy with grief and love, a final haunting testament to a battle too painful for memory, too costly for pride, and far too important to ever be truly forgotten. Slow pan across Panel 3 East at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the names gleaming softly under a setting sun. In the distance, a lone bugler plays taps, the notes drifting across the water as unseen tears fall for the boys who never came home. Fade to black.